Yeah.
I'll just click back over to it and make sure it works.
Okay.
Do you take her with you when you go there?
Yep, we're good to go.
Okay. Well, good morning. The Lord be with you. It's good to be back with you all at one point when we were last fall when we were doing the African American religious biography. Somebody asked me about blacks and education, and I gave a short, quick answer and said that was a longer story. And then Michael said, well, we've got this 3-week period. Can you do something in? And I thought, okay, well, we'll do the longer story. And blacks in higher education, I may sound, I think, maybe like now we're getting into sort of a more obscure academic kind of topic, perhaps. But there are some underlying sort of things I think that are pertinent to us, because not only is it a story of African American perseverance and determination in the way that the church moved among blacks, but part of what we're going to look at is the extent to which white Christians did or did not come alongside of blacks in that prospect. And one of the underlying themes here, and a question that I wonder about and think about, is when race relations and racial views change for the better, how does that happen? And when some people or some groups are able to make a step forward or steps forward, what are the conditions under which that takes place? So this is not the story of blacks in higher education. This is just a story with some of those themes underneath it, with some of those questions that I wonder about that are part of the whole thing. So a little bit on first of all, on terminology, I just want to mention there is a term that you may be familiar with, but if not, I wanted to mention this. What is often called an HBCU, a historically black college or university, and these are institutions, well, that historically have been black colleges or universities, sort of like the black church, or a black denomination like the AME denomination that we talked about, an institution run and operated by blacks. And I want to mention that because that's going to be a key part of our story, because if you think about, well, I went back and looked at all the people that we were featured during our series on African American religious biography who went to college. And I want to show you something about all of those people that Pastor Michael and Andrea Ramsey talked about. And I want to point out something. The formatting got thrown off here on this when I transferred it over, so it's a bit hard to see, but because things are kind of messed up. But every single one from Mary Church Terrell to Mary McLeod Bethune to Ida B. Wells, Benjamin Mays, Martin Luther King Jr., Howard Thurman, James Cone, either attended an HBCU or taught at an HBCU, or both in some situations, such as Benjamin Mays, who went to Virginia Baptist Union and then taught at Morehouse. And the other thing to notice about that is that these blacks all these were all Christian institutions. There are some HBCUs that were set up by the government, they're state-run, but there are a number of them that are also set up that are private and come out of church organizations and church institutions. And so there's an interesting little pattern in here. Now, what is true is that some of these people, of course, would go to a Christian institution because they became Christian leaders in some ways. But a lot of very important blacks who went to college, especially in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, HBCUs play a very important part in that whole process. And that's going to be part of our story here over the next couple of weeks. There were some of the people I talked about, Oluwade Equiano and Richard Allen and Frederick Douglass and Henry McNeill Turner, for instance, of course, did not go to college. And that was for a number of reasons. Although one thing we have to remember is that colleges in the early 19th century were actually pretty rare. There were a lot of people that did not go to college. Abraham Lincoln didn't go to college, for instance. But what you do see is a college building kind of impulse in American history in the 19th century. So during the colonial era, up until about the founding, there were 15 colleges founded. Then in the first 40 years after independence, another 54. But then look at that. At the next 40 years, 1820 to 1860, 312 more were found. I mean, there was this boom of planting colleges in the 19th century that kicked in sometime after 1820. So that, of the 381 by the time of the Civil War, 312 had just been founded. Now, this did still represent just 1% of the population. So very few people at that time really did go on to college, but it was something that was growing quite a bit. And of course, as you can imagine, the opportunities for blacks to go to college because of racism and opportunity at the time were very, very small. 90% of blacks in America at this point were enslaved, and of the other 10%, 5% of them lived in the South, where there were, where things were just really, really bad, and there were no real opportunities. And in the North, of course, there was, number one, not much opportunity, but also colleges that just did not accept. There were here and there blacks that did. And the one that officially made a policy of accepting blacks was Oberlin College, up close to us here in Ohio, which originally was founded as a Christian college. Actually, it came out of the revivalist evangelical movement, and they wrote into their policy that they will accept. It was really cutting edge for its time, because it was both males and females, which was uncommon. There were some female colleges, some small ones that kind of did different kinds of things, and most other colleges were all male. They accepted both male and female, and they accepted people regardless of race also. And so before the Civil War, about 275 blacks attended Oberlin, although most of those were at this time, sometimes colleges would act also as high schools, kind of preparation for college. So a good number of those blacks and a good number of whites were taking the prep courses. 23 blacks graduated with a college degree. But this was exceptional. Most colleges and universities did not accept blacks, and Harvard University accepted 3 blacks into their medical school in 1850 and then withdrew the acceptance because white students put pressure on the administration, didn't want blacks acting with them. So racism was a real problem in the whole process. And that's why one person who's important is this man, Daniel Alexander Payne. Sorry about the formatting, got thrown off here a little bit. But Daniel Alexander Payne is important. He was born as a free black in Charleston, South Carolina, became a dedicated Methodist, and had an experience early on. When he was 15, he had a conversion experience, and it was He reported later, he said, he felt as if the hands of a man were pressing on my two shoulders, then right after this during one of his prayers. And he said he heard a voice speaking within his soul saying, I have set thee apart to educate thyself in order that thou mayest be an educator to my people. And so he feels senses this very strong sense of calling from God to educate blacks. And he went north, became a minister, joined the AME Church, right, African Methodist Episcopal Church, a black separate denomination, and then immediately began working on helping to, he himself went to college, went to Gettysburg College and Seminary, interestingly, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and then set about educating fellow ministers so that their level of education would be higher. And then became a bishop, rose up fairly quickly, became a bishop in the AME Church. When the Civil War broke out, there was a college that the largely white Methodist denomination had founded in Ohio, Wilberforce University, and they actually had founded it for blacks, and it lasted a few years, and then when the Civil War broke out, most of the black students went off and joined the Union Army, as blacks did in large numbers, and suddenly the schools started failing, and that Methodist church wanted to sell it. Somehow Daniel Alexander Payne got in conversation with them, and he just bought it. He just decided on his own to buy it for the denomination, which meant that he didn't have the money. This is really an act of faith, but he took out a loan and trusted that the AME was going to be able to raise the funds to pay for Wilberforce University. So the black AME denomination bought it from the largely white Methodist denomination. And somehow it worked. This is, talk about an act of faith, buying a college on your own. I don't even know if it was within the bounds of the denominational. They probably didn't have any rules about, now if you're going to buy a college, you have to go through this process for, I don't know. Anyway, he just, things were a little looser at that point, I think. And Wilberforce becomes, really in some ways, the first HBCU. There was another black college, but it was more like a prep school, and it actually did not grant college degrees. So there were other institutions like that. But Daniel Alexander Payne was determined that this would be a college of standing for blacks, and it has lasted. And you go to Xenia, Ohio today, and it is still there. It is still a largely black college, but this is one of the famous ones. And this goes back to the point about the way many blacks felt they had to go, and I think they probably did have to go, was because there was so much racism in white society and so few opportunities for them in white institutions, there was a need to strike out on their own and form independent institutions, like independent denominations, AME Zion, Black Baptist churches, and then with that, black colleges. And so this kind of sets the terms for HBCUs. But at the time of the Civil War, that was pretty much it for blacks. It was Wilberforce, and can you get into, Oberlin, maybe another college here or there. And then the Civil War, of course, is going to bring abolition, and you are going to have suddenly freedom, of course, for 4 million formerly enslaved people. And many of them, of course, widespread interest in education across the South among blacks. But the vast majority of them aren't even literate, let alone college, prepared for college, but they will really, really want to go off to college. Whites were not real interested in forming colleges and universities. Most whites were not real interested in forming colleges and universities for blacks. And at the time of the Civil War, blacks have very, very few resources, as you can imagine. If you're looking at African Americans as a whole, little money, hardly any money really, when you look at the 4.5 million blacks at that time, and most of them had been enslaved, and very little educational resources. You know, who among them are going to be the teachers and administrators to be able to do that? How is that going to happen? There are then some, and what does happen after the Civil War is that blacks persevere very, very strongly in trying to set up educational institutions and gave sacrificially. Many of them, many people with very, very little income, and worked tirelessly. You can get that a little bit if you think back to Andrew Ramsey's talking about, for instance, Mary McLeod Bethune, just all that she did to try to build up her college, building her own construction chairs. Sorry about the mic thing. If there's a way I can stop. Anyway, constructing their own chairs for the college. I don't feel like I'm doing anything, but then these things happen to me also. So it would really, really help, we can put it this way, it would really, really help if other people came alongside blacks with help with resources in many ways. And it's going to be a complicated story because some people do that. But to understand that, and then some underlying sort of issues that are going there, I'm going to take a detour that at first is going to sound really, really odd. I'm just telling you, but this story will be, remember the story will be continued next week and the week after that. But for the remaining of the time here, to help explain that process where whites come alongside blacks, we have to go to Burma. Okay, Burma. Stay with me, it'll make sense eventually. But Burma, we're going to Burma and we're going to talk about Baptists because Burma is actually going to play an important role in helping some white Baptists change their thinking about race, which is going to play into our story here. So here's the context in Burma. And let me say this also. There's something else I've got a project where I'm working on here, and my thinking about this, and I mentioned this a year ago when I did a series on Vice, is that maybe, now this is still partially baked, okay? It's not fully baked yet. I hope it's a little more than half baked, but this is something I'm working on. But maybe it's possible to think about virtues and vices not just on an individual level, but on a collective level, because it seems to me, especially if you look at something like racism, that racism works very much like a cultural vice. A vice is a sin that gets repeated in a pattern, right, and a habit. And that certainly is racism. And it gets stuck into this groove, and it's very hard to get out of. It needs to be replaced by a virtue, other sort of practices and habits. And by golly, racism is a deep and difficult vice. I mean, it is a deep groove, if you will. And so one of the questions that I'm asking is if we look at it this way, and I think that part of the vice of racism goes right down to pride. Human beings categorize other people. We can't help but make categories. But we tend to do unconsciously even, is categorize people in such a way to make ourselves look better than we are and others look worse than what they are. That's just a impulse we have, and there are all sorts of implicit biases that psychologists have identified for human beings, that we do this individually. We tend to look at evidence and recognize the evidence we want to see and disregard evidence we don't want to see. We tend to favor the things that are familiar to us and look down upon things that aren't familiar to us. We tend to, when something goes wrong to us, blame external forces, and when things go right, take credit for ourselves. And it's also biblical. Why do you see the speck in your brother's eye and you don't see the log in your own eye? I mean, that is pride. And it seems to me that on some level, in a lot of different ways, race is categorizing on other people in a way that sometimes explicitly, I mean, actually, you do know, to quote Bob Dylan, why does it? How many times must a man now I'm blowing my Bob Dylan line, sorry about that, and pretend that he just doesn't see. There's that. How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that no, I knew it would come after a while, and pretend that he just doesn't see, pretend that he doesn't see. That's sometimes what happens with racism. And sometimes it's unconscious. And I'll quote Simon and Garfunkel, man sees what he wants to see and disregards the rest. Lie to lie, lie, lie to lie to lie. But this is, I think, what Jesus is getting at a lot of times, not only in the log in your brother's eye, but many other times when he's talking about sight. In John 9, when he heals the man who was born blind, and the man slowly comes to see that Jesus is the Son of God. But the Pharisees don't see that, and they can't believe, they refuse to believe that this man was born blind. They're turning their head, and they pretend that they just don't see. And Jesus has this interesting little point at the end about the blind seeing and those who see being blind, something along the lines of that. Anyway, that's my thinking about race. Okay, so I'm going to Burma. Here's the situation in Burma. In the 1830s, a movement in Burma of Christianity breaks out among a people called the Karen people. And the Karen were not the more civilized people who lived in the cities. There were Burmans who were Buddhists who lived in the cities, that were part of a kingdom that was an ancient kingdom that goes back centuries. They had Pali philosophy among their priests and writing that goes back centuries and centuries, and were involved in trade in Southeast Asia, all over. They were a kingdom. The Karen, however, were a people group that spoke a different language, lived in the hills, could not read, were not, as we might think of, highly economically developed. And a movement of Christianity breaks out among them. There were Baptist missionaries who'd gone there, and there's a big story of that. But it grew really pretty rapidly. Between 1830 and 1840, 16,000 Karen became Christians. And that's quite a bit. And by the way, Christianity remains a very strong movement among the Karen today, and there are Karen who have become refugees and come to the United States. Pastor Michael worked with a group of them in one of his former churches up near Cleveland. But what you have to realize is, think about this situation. By 1840, there were 16,000 Karen Christians and about 6 Baptist missionaries. How do you keep up with a group like that if there are just 6 of you? And they're spread out in many places all over Burma. And the answer is you can't fully keep up with them. So that's one important sort of thing to realize, because largely this movement of Christianity and the evangelism and the leading of the churches and the organizing of the people was done by Karen leaders, by Karen evangelists. I mean, they were the foot soldiers, if you will. Well, more than foot soldiers. That's not the right metaphor. They were the real leaders of this movement in Burma. And they, by the way, very interested in education. They want to read books. The Baptist missionaries are just publishing as much. They had to translate the Bible into Karen. They had to write materials in the Karen language. They have to teach Karen how to lead, and they are just publishing as much material as they can, and they printed thousands of Bibles, and the Karen just snatched them all up. So the Baptist missionaries are having a hard time keeping up with them. Now, we have to notice there is a racial dynamic that is going on here, and a cultural dynamic, because missionaries, not just Baptist missionaries in Burma, but missionaries all over the world coming from the United States and England and Germany and so forth, those coming from the West, carried with them stereotypes of other people, as you can imagine, at that time. And their stereotypes a lot of times were at that time framed in there are civilized people and there are uncivilized people. And the Karen were definitely in the category of uncivilized people. And the missionaries, we have missionaries even writing about this. They don't have cities, they can't read, they don't have advanced technology, they don't have schools, they live in the wilderness, they're wild men. And there is also a sense that because they are like this, uncivilized people, they are primitive, they are also then not advanced morally and probably not advanced intellectually. This is just how missionaries and the vast majority of white Westerners thought of people like this. Why? I mean, it was embedded in Western culture. This was, I would say, part of the vice of racism. In fact, for the missionaries who come to Burma, as they look at the Karen, who they, okay, as a new people group, who are they most similar to in their experience and their way of thinking? They say, the Native Americans. They're a lot like the Native Americans. Well, what did most whites think of Native Americans in the 1830s? This is the era of the Trail of Tears, right? These are people who cannot be civilized. They can't interact with Americans, and so we have to push them off to Oklahoma or other places because they're savage and kind of wild and maybe violent, and they won't be able to live with whites. And so you have embedded in this view of the civilized and the uncivilized this framework that promotes a sort of a haughty, paternalistic, condescending, and stereotypical views of other people. And so race is a real factor here in this whole process. And by the way, I should mention this also. If it is a vice, underlying all vices is some sort of pride. Pride in the biblical sense is the pride of thinking yourself either higher than others or thinking that you know enough that you can arrange the world in such a way or see the world in such a way that it operates according to your terms and you're not fully understanding or submitting to God in the process. And that affects how you view other people too. And the Bible does talk about pride not only individually but collectively. There are passages in the Old Testament where in collective groups, in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they talk about the sinful pride of Judah and Israel. They also took Sodom and Moab and Egypt and the Ammonites to task for the sin of pride, this sort of haughty, condescending view of other people. Or we can think of the Pharisees, just most of the Pharisees, as we see their problems, is that sin of pride that permeates them. So we have this, that civilized people could look down upon uncivilized people for not being moral enough or religiously pure enough or something like that. But here's the situation in Burma. Burma, with this movement of Karen Christianity, throws a real wrench in that model of how you think of the civilized and uncivilized for a number of different reasons. First of all, the missionaries have to admit they're going over to Burma to try to evangelize and build a Christian movement, and they have to admit that the vast majority of the evangelism is done by the Karen, not by them. They realize, and they're saying over and over again, the gospel is going forth on the backs of the Karen evangelists. These Karen leaders are doing the main work, and it is growing because of what they do. These Karen leaders who, many of them have just learned how to read. Some of them don't know how to read. They're just learning about a number of different things. They are clearly uncivilized in that category. That's a factor. The other thing is, the missionaries are so outnumbered, you had some missionaries who are working among the Burman people, but the number at this time who are working among the Karen, like I said, are about half a dozen, that they can't keep up with all the Karen in terms of what they are doing. And when they can't keep up with them, they're limited in how much they can control them and direct them. Right? Just because of the situation, the Karen are out doing their thing. And then starting in the late 1830s, a political situation threw a very specific kind of problem into the whole works. The British were busy colonizing everywhere they could colonize, it seems, along with a few other European countries. And they had gone to war against the Kingdom of Burma and had taken over some parts of Burma. In the light pink, those parts of Burma is what they had taken over in a war in around 1815. But now, in 1840, they are making noise like they're going to take over more of Burma. And eventually they will. Eventually they will take over the entire kingdom and colonize it and conquer it and rule it. It won't happen until the 1880s. But in the 1850s, they'll take over the red part, and then by the 1880s, they'll take over the yellow part. But the Burmese government is feeling it about in the 1840s for various reasons. There are conflicts, there are tensions, and they realize how powerful the British are, and they are worried that the British are going to take over, and rightfully so. Rightfully worried, I mean, not rightfully so that the British are going to take over. I'm not in favor of colonization. Don't get that understood. The Burman government is rightfully worried about the British taking over. And in that process, they become suspicious, the Burman government officials do, of the missionaries, but also of the Karen Christians. Now, the missionaries are American, but the Burman government feels like they are friends of the British, which they are, although they have to be careful with the missionaries, because if they treat them too badly, that might provoke war with Britain, which they don't want. But the Karen, they feel like they can take care of the Karen. They can do something to the Karen, and the British government won't care about that, which is true. The British government won't care about what the Burman government does with the Karen. But they feel like the Karen, especially if they learn how to read, they will be an ally of the Americans, which will make them an ally of the British. And so the Burman government begins to arrest Karen, throw them in jail, urge them to renounce Christianity, crack down on the Karen in various ways. There were Baptist missionaries in the yellow and the red areas on the map that were under the control at this time of the Burman government. Eventually they feel like not only are we in danger, but we're endangering the Karen. Because the Karen were told, don't visit the missionaries, and they would anyway. And the Karen were told, you cannot have books with you, and they'd come to the missionaries to get books anyway. And I have a missionary who's saying, I can't give you books. It's going to going to put you in danger. And they would slip out and just grab them anyway and take them. I mean, these Karen were very, very passionate about Christianity, even with the missionaries saying, no, 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 for your own safety, stay out of this. But eventually the missionaries say, we've got to move out. And so those that were stationed in the yellow or red areas move out to the pink areas, which were under British control. And what that does is move most of the missionaries further away from these Karen Christians. Now how are you going to be a missionary overseeing these Karen Christians when you're even further away? And what are the Karen going to do about it? Well, this is what the Karen evangelists do about it. They go and see the missionaries anyway, secretly, even though if they are caught by the British, they will oftentimes be jailed or beaten, or both. One missionary, a man by the name of Elisha Abbott, moved to a part in the pink on the very west side, and he was a missionary who'd come there and been there for about 10 years working with the Karen. Karen evangelists would take 12-day journeys to see him. That's how long it took to get there. And some of them would get arrested along the way. But they wanted more books. They wanted more teaching. They wanted to understand. I mean, essentially, he's their theological instructor. But they felt like it was worth. And then they would bring young men with them who wanted to get baptized. So, because, who's going to baptize the new Christians? Because the Karen aren't ordained. They're under Baptist way of thinking, you're not ordained, you can't baptize. So then suddenly what you had were, and women couldn't make the trip and older people couldn't make the trip, but you'd have Karen evangelists and Karen young men who would take these 10, 12-day trips, and they'd have to, kind of avoid the Burmese authority just to come and learn and get baptized. And Elisha Abbott is like, my goodness, what, this is really something. This went on for several years. And, it's obviously not an ideal missionary situation, but something happens here. This missionary, the key missionary here, Elisha Abbott, he begins to suddenly, he sees the Karen evangelists impress him. Let's just put it this way. He realizes, wow, there is really something about these people. He wrote about one young Karen evangelist by the name of Shui Bo, who had been coming to see him regularly over a period of 3 years, taking that 10-day trip. And one day, Shui Bo arrived and said that several of his fellow Karen evangelists had been arrested by the Burman authorities, and they'd been thrown in jail. And he said, and they knew who I was, and they were out after me too. And he said, Shui Bo told Elisha Abbott, he said, I have to go back and turn myself in. And the reason he said, I have to go back and turn myself in is because if I don't, they know who I am, they know what village I come from. They will come and they will attack the village, and they might beat and kill villagers, because many of them are also Christians also, to get to me. So I have to go back. And the next morning he did. Elisha Abbott wrote about this. And he realized Shui Bo and Abbott both realized he might be killed. Now, as it turned out, in the long run, he went back, he turned himself in, he was arrested, under custody, maybe he was beaten, I don't know. But the official said, okay, the official told him, you must not worship this Christian God. And Shui Bo said, I must. And then the official said, you must not preach. And Shui Bo just was quiet and said nothing. And then he released Shui Bo. So Shui Bo was not held in. But that's interesting. I mean, that is courage for the faith. That is self-sacrificial love. But there's something else going on here. And let me among the Karen. Let me give you another example. There was another Karen man who arrived at Abbott's home, physically weakened because he'd been in jail and he was beaten. And Abbott asked this Karen man how he felt while he was being beaten in jail. And the man said while he was being beaten, he prayed for the Burman official who was beating him. And Abbott said, weren't you angry at this Burman official? And the Karen man said, no, I told them they might beat me to death if they wished, but they would not make me angry, and that I should live again at the resurrection. I mean, this is remarkable. And Elisha Abbott, he comes from upstate New York. He's never seen religious persecution like this. He's never seen anybody have to deal with their life is in danger for holding on to Christianity. And by the way, there are Christians around the world in some places who are facing very similar things like this today. But I want to point out a characteristic here of this man and of Shui Bo. I think it is the proper understanding of meekness. That word meek is a word that it's an old word, but starting in the 18th century, a new definition was that meek equals weak. That's like passive and timid. It carries those connotations. But if you go back theologically to the earlier theologians who talk about meekness, meekness is not lashing out at others, especially when you are angry. Not taking revenge, not either fighting back or lashing out at them, or when somebody says something to you, maybe unjustly, but you will not try to strike back at them. And this is meekness. That you are not going to strike back at them, which is a remarkable Christian virtue when you get right down to it. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So Abbott is very, very impressed. I mean, this is sacrificial love. And that really does a number on his categories of the civilized versus the uncivilized. These are still really, quote unquote, uncivilized people. So on top of that, Abbott has a practical problem, because these young men are coming to him for baptism, and there are women who are not getting baptized, and he can't himself take the 12-day journey back to oversee the people. How can you run? And plus, when they do come to him for baptism, he is supposed to examine the candidates to see if they are really truly Christian, if they've really truly dedicated, although taking a 12-day trip and risking your life would seem to me to be an indication that you really are dedicated. But he's following the Baptist policies. I have to give them an examination. He's never met these people before, and he has to trust the Korean evangelists to tell him, yes, we've seen him, we believe he's sincere, his character is right, he really does want to become a Christian for the right reasons and that sort of thing. And this idea forms in Elisha Abbott's head. And the idea is, why not ordain the Korean evangelists? Why not? They're already acting like pastors. They are preaching, they're examining candidates, they're overseeing villages and congregations and that sort of thing. And so he floats the idea to supporters back home, to his mission board, and also they're publishing a missionary magazine that Baptists all over, churches and so forth, will read. And Elisha Abbott makes this argument. He says, look, if these men are competent to preach the gospel and qualified to lead and instruct Christian congregations, why not recognize them also as competent to administer the ordinances? Don't you think they have the Christian character to be able to do that? And there's over a period of year, he's writing, from time to time in the Baptist Missionary Magazine, talking about this idea. And a debate breaks out, because not everybody agrees. There was another missionary who lived down far south in Burma, in an area that had been controlled by the British for 20 years, by the name of Francis Mason. And he says, no, I don't think that would be a good idea. Francis Mason says, look, acquaintance with the native character has raised insuperable obstacles in my mind. We may attach too much importance to the native assistants as independent agents. Karen Christians are not mature enough to be considered full-grown children. He said, Americans, if you want to understand what it means to be uncivilized, he says, Americans in a Christian and enlightened country like the United States need to imagine this. Take away all your knowledge of earth and history and astronomy and chemistry and geometry and navigation, the basic principles of arithmetic. You also have to eliminate your familiarity with the arts and machinery and printing and agriculture and medicine. And Asians lack the mental discipline for learning. But the biggest thing is, and they believe in demons. And this, spiritual world of demons and so forth. So I don't think it would be wise to, he says, I don't think it would be wise to ordain them as ministers. They're not even mature enough to be full-grown children. Okay, and so he writes, in the magazine. So you get this debate going back and forth. Back in the United States, people are reading this. What are they thinking? Well, let's go to this man, Solomon Peck. Solomon Peck's going to be an important character in this story. Solomon Peck is weighing and considering both of these things, and he hasn't been to Burma, but he's trying to figure out what's the best policy. He says it's worthy of serious question how far it is safe to instruct the native teachers in their present comparative ignorance, the power of the gospel ministry. He says, if you believe Elisha Abbott, they've shown these amazing Christian qualities, but if you believe Francis Mason, they're not mature enough to be full-grown children. The case involves, on either hand, a fearful responsibility. Well, the case was made by default because under the Baptist system, essentially, congregations and their ministers are kind of the highest authority, and Baptist ministers can mostly do whatever they want to. They don't have presbyteries and sessions and things like that. And so Elisha Abbott just decided, okay, I'm going to ordain Korean evangelists, and he began ordaining. And that kind of opened the door. And other missionaries kind of joined in. And Solomon Peck became convinced as he looked at this and he was debating this. He became convinced, I think this is the way to go. I think this is the way to go. I think we really do, all things considered, I think we really should ordain Korean evangelists. But they're going to need education. If they're going to be ministers, we really are going to have to do some sort of serious system of explicitly and intentionally educating these ministers. And so Solomon Peck, who by the way, he's the head of the Baptist agencies. You can think of him as kind of like the president of the missionary organization. So he has a lot of power. He has a lot of influence back home. And a lot of and he's running the day-to-day operations, overseeing the day-to-day operations of the missionary agency. And so, and they have yearly meetings, and he reports and so forth. And he convinces a number of people. And so he says, what we need to do? We need to build a seminary. We need to build a seminary for these Korean evangelists. And so in 1843, they build the Korean Theological Seminary to train the ministers, to educate them in theology and the Bible and so forth. But then they also realize, the other thing, though, is the Korean are going to have to teach themselves. Like, many of them are still illiterate. They're going to have to learn just even basic reading, let alone all the other sort of things you need to learn. So we also need to train teachers. And very early on, like in the second year, they set aside 1/3 of the positions in the Korean Theological Seminary for women, so that the Korean women can become teachers. So you have this precedent of you're training men, you're training women, and they are to become preachers and teachers. And with that idea of becoming preachers and teachers, there is a phrase that emerges from this whole process that the Baptists use, and then interestingly enough, this is going to be part of our story, missionary organizations in other places begin to use it also because they also, for different reasons, are establishing, well, slightly different reasons, different situation, are establishing seminaries in other parts of the world. They call it the native ministry. What we need to build up is the native ministry. And so that's the Koren Theological Seminary. And that sets a precedent. And I think then, you see, you can get a guess of where I'm going with this. Through this whole process, you're starting to develop what I would say cultural virtues. And think about it in this way. At this time, the 1840s and 1850s, let's go to the most famous scientist in the United States at the time, was a guy at Harvard by the name of Louis Agassiz. And he was the most influential and the most famous scientist, and he wrote on the development of humans over time, kind of like anthropology. And this is what he had to say about this sort of thing. He says, it's mock philanthropy and mock philosophy to assume that all the races have the same abilities, enjoy the same powers, and show the same natural dispositions. He writes this article in 1850, and which he said, it's just ridiculous to think that you can educate these people that they have the same abilities. That's not how human beings are. He said human beings are very, very different, and some just don't have these capabilities. He later says, what would be the best education imparted to the different races in consequence of their primitive difference? Well, human affairs with reference to the colored races would be far more judiciously conducted if we were guided by a full consciousness of the real difference existing between us and them, rather than treating them on the terms of equality. This is the default mode in America and in Europe. What the Baptists are doing in Burma is the exception. And so realize the context of the time is such that, and the authority of some of the the top scientists. In fact, anthropology in the 19th century, this is what this is the dominant view of other people in anthropology. There are primitive races in the world. They would say, like, Africans have been, in fact, Agassiz said this himself, Africans are as primitive as the time of Pharaoh. They haven't advanced at all in 4,000 years. They don't have the capabilities. And that is feeding into the cultural vices of racism, and is one of the problems, and will be a real obstacle towards this idea of course, why not build colleges for blacks? So I leave you with this question. What are the cultural virtues of the native ministry? What just happened in Burma? The missionaries went over with these kind of haughty and condescending ideas, and after they've been there a while, and even kind of almost without thinking of them in the ways we think about it, they're ending up building a seminary. And I think a lot of that was due to the Koren themselves in showing their capabilities, given the opportunity and their opportunities, and their passion, and that amazing, some of these are deep spiritual qualities, the amazing meekness and self-sacrificial love that they have for one another. And it helps convince the missionaries to establish a school, which is a pattern, which is a habit. It is a virtue, if you will, that has within it, whether the missionaries fully realize it or not, because some missionaries aren't totally on board here, but has within it the assumption that all people are capable of academic achievements, regardless of race or culture. That missionaries don't have to be fully in control. They can ordain Koren pastors, and they don't have to control them and oversee them, since with this assumption that they know better and they know what they are doing. Better than the Koren. And that actually there's something to empowering and giving opportunities to non-whites. Now, that's part of the story on the white side. Back in the United States, very few people have bought into this yet, but that's next week. I have to give you, some reason to come back next week to say, okay, so then What happens back in the United States, and how does this play into it? We will see. Questions or comments, observations from anybody?
How many people knew the Koran race before they came this morning?
Wow.
What happened to Shui Bo?
Yeah, you know, some of these Koran, so some of this is my own historical research that I've done, and some of them pop up, and you hear about them, and then you don't hear about them anymore, because it's whatever the missionaries write about at any given time. And Elisha Abbott was around, and then he died like 10 years later after this, and I haven't run across Shui Bo anymore after that. But he was one of hundreds. There were a lot of Korean evangelists like him.
So my understanding is that this is still a discussion within mission.
Yeah.
That we haven't come that far, and that actually right now that some of it has to do with finances. That bringing native missionaries to the States, because it's the better education, they stay and don't go back. And that the effort to have native seminaries and do local training, even for lay pastors, is still a debate. I mean, we debate it within our presbytery.
Right.
And we value lay pastors in the same way that we value seminary trained pastors.
Yes.
And I don't know.
It is still a debate in different organizations, and it is complicated. It gets more complicated, but it is still a debate which I could go about 5 different directions with that. But I'll leave it at that. It's a debate, and maybe we can come back to that a little bit later. But there is sometimes, maybe I'll tie it into this point. There is sometimes a tendency for us to even unconsciously favor those we are familiar with, right? There are missionaries, and then there are indigenous African pastors or indigenous Chinese pastors or so forth, and they're in a different system, and so we will pay missionaries. I mean, I know of situations where we got missionaries in Zambia get paid a certain amount in a college, and then the Africans there get paid much, much lower. Why? Well, but there's a lot more. It gets even more complicated than that. But Sue,
maybe observing from too generalizing, but didn't Christianity spread pretty much like we're experiencing with people like the Korean? It seems like we're forgetting what really happened. Originally, they weren't ordained, and some of them not even literate, slaves on Roman ships and so on, carrying the message eagerly, just like those folks. Am I missing something?
You know, yeah, and there's some things going on here. What the missionaries at that time could not see, and what we're starting to understand through study and missionary theology today, but it applies to a lot of other things, is at the time they'd look at the Koran, they're just barely literate. They don't have the education or the skills, the capabilities that missionaries have. But then you forget a couple things. Actually, they are experts at certain things, even if they're illiterate. They're experts at their own culture. They know their own culture better than the missionaries do. They know their own language much better. Missionaries, you could work to learn the language. How long does it take to learn it fluently, that you can talk about things like the atonement and incarnation in the local language? And if so, this is I think something keep in mind. Like even if we're talking about ministries in the Presbyterian Church, like maybe Native Americans out in South Dakota, they are experts in their own culture. They know things that we don't know about what they are facing. Whites working with blacks. Whites have got to realize blacks know their own situation a lot better than we do. We ought to be listening to them for that reason, right? People, so the expertise is not just, I say this as a professor, academic, quote unquote, expertise, although academics can maybe shine light on this very point. But expertise can also be, do you know your own, how well do you know this particular culture, these people, this situation? And then that's another reason for, I like the phrase coming alongside instead of coming and teaching these people who are under you.
Thank you. I just want to say I enjoyed what you were talking about. In my family, we have two people who graduated from historically black universities, my husband and my youngest daughter. And one of the things that they say is that we don't teach people, we develop leaders. And so what you're saying is, yes, there may be some differences, but when they come out from our school, they can teach you.
Yeah, yes. That's a very important point. And that's going to be an important point to keep in mind next week and the week after that. As we talk about this, that in going to a HBCU, the sort of philosophy is, we don't just teach, we develop leaders, right? I mean, and that can mean a lot of things. Part of what's implied in that is you're developing character in people, and when they come out, they can teach others or develop others, which also means, I think you might be implying that blacks have things to teach whites. I think that's in there also. I think that's a very important thing that we have to realize too. And in the way we are wired, I know for a lot of whites, sometimes there's a knee-jerk reaction of, wait a minute, I'm not when blacks are bringing up something that is a different point of view, and I get this sometimes with some of my white students, immediately they get defensive. Well, wait a minute, though. I'm not a racist. You're telling me that I'm a racist because we're studying this racist stuff, and it's like, wait, calm down, stop. None of us have everything together. We need to listen and learn from one another, and that involves a certain amount of humility. That's another character. That's the other side of cultural pride, is cultural humility, which is a part of that whole process too. But I think that's a very important point. And you have to develop relationships. That's an excellent point too. That's a virtue. We could add this as a virtue here, right? You're developing a relationship here between missionaries and Karen evangelists. It's because Elisha Abbott knows Shui Bo, or knows these evangelists, that he can talk to them and listen to their story and say, wow, this is, in essence, I see the glory of God in you. In some ways. So, all right, well, I have to go sing. So we will close off. I'll say a quick prayer. Dear Father, help us to teach us all more humility and the ability to listen to others and to see how you are at work in many different ways. In your name we pray. Amen.